Greetings, my friends. Difficult times, and we have Doug Arion here, both an astronomer and a physicist who worked in our nation's defense to talk about what's going on regarding potential nuclear war. Does that get your attention? Doug, how do you do?
Very well. A pleasure to be back with you, Bradley. This will be a different topic for us after all the astronomy discussions we've had in the past.
Right. Uh, what are your thoughts when you watch the television? You're from, my generation pretty much. And so you know the feeling of growing up, I believe, thinking, maybe you won't make it to old age. I remember that.
Yeah, when we were young and in school, we had, fire drills. If there was a fire, how you got the students out. We also used to have things called shelter drills. What you would do if, I grew up in New York, if New York came under attack, how students would be protected in their school. So it was a very serious thing, really believing that a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union could really happen.
Oh, yeah.
Back in the 60s.
People had stocks of food and water in their cellar, sort of makeshift bomb shelters or fallout shelters. And some people had much fancier fallout shelters. My father, we lived in a very small town. My father was tasked. He had the Geiger counter. So his job was to go out and see if it was okay to go out. And we lived near Pease Air Force Base, which was a strategic air command base, undoubtedly would have been a target. And to give people an idea of how real it was, back in the day, there were lots of sonic booms because they didn't have rules about where the jet planes flew. They were really loud enough so they broke our windows. But things got so scary, nuclear-wise, that sometimes when there would be a sonic boom, we would go and see if there was a mushroom cloud to go along with it. That's true story. And, of course, when you're growing up like that, you don't see yourself having a real future. And that, my theory is that is one of the reasons for the hedonism of the 60s. But I completely digress. Now, you're here because you're, besides being awesome, a physicist. You worked for the defense of our nation in the nuclear department. So can you talk about what you did back in those days?
So when I finished graduate school in the early 80s, which was still a height of the Cold War period, really, I went to work. I was recruited to and went to work for a company called Science Applications. It was in the DC area, or offices across the country. And I became one of the chief scientists in our nuclear testing activities. And the part that we worked on was testing and validating that all of our equipment would survive a nuclear exchange. So we actually built experiments out underground in Nevada and instrumented them, taking whole missiles and satellites and ground systems, space systems, and tested them to make sure that we would maintain our warfighting capability if a nuclear exchange actually happened. I spent 15 years doing that work.
Were these all underground by that time?
Yeah, that was all underground. We went underground in the 60s. So by the time I was involved in the 80s, we were about 2 miles underground in Rainier Mesa in central Nevada doing this work.
I did visit Los Alamos and saw a lot of those exhibits. It is fascinating. Yeah. And what did you find out? Would all our stuff work?
Yes, it would. And the key thing, and the things I can't talk about here are how much radiation and how much blast we gave each piece of equipment. That tells you what it would survive to. And right. The goal, of course, is to not let somebody know, well, that's what you're protected to, so I can come in over here and get you.
Right.
We knew, okay, this is what we think the threat is. We test that and make sure that we can continue to operate there. So it was a very big effort.
Does it seem a little strange to you that it's our old adversary? It's really us versus them? Same enemy?
It's mind-boggling that here we are. It's been 80 plus years, since we were involved with them in World War II, right? World War II started over 80 years ago. Yeah. And here we are still dealing with the same things. It is mind-blowing. It is really mind-blowing.
How do nuclear weapons work? Give me the nuts and bolts. I know they work differently than the original, I believe they work differently than the original Fat
Mhm.
Man and Little Boy, but how do they work?
Well, the basic principle is the same. There are types of atoms, heavy atoms, that naturally break apart. And when they break apart, they release energy. And so if you force a whole bunch of these atoms together so that they all break apart basically at the same time, you get a huge release of energy. And the two materials that do that best are uranium, a particular kind of uranium, and plutonium. So the basic operation of a nuclear weapon is you have a chunk of plutonium, you have some explosive that compresses it. When it gets compressed, the atoms are close together and they all release the energy at the same time. So that's
Why
the basic operation.
why plutonium and uranium? What is it about them? They're unstable. Does that mean they have more things flying around than the simple ones?
Right. So the atoms are so big and there are so many protons in each atom. Remember, protons all have the same charge and they don't like each other. Charges repel. So these things are really trying to break apart. There's just too much stuff in one place. They want to break apart. And so if you can give them enough sort of kick to get them going, they break apart and more particles fly out and make other ones break apart. So these things just break apart very, very quickly. Very, very quickly, we're talking billionths of a second. You can get a huge chunk of material to release all its energy. And that creates a huge explosion.
Is the detonation different in the new devices than it was in the old days?
Oh, yes. Yeah. The whole structure is much more advanced. In the weapons that we build and that the Russians build, they're very advanced and have all sorts of different materials in there to get the most oomph out of the smallest amount of material. And in a backwards way, that's helpful because our weapons, if they go off, use up all that nuclear material. So you get most of the biggest blast you can.
But it cleaner?
Look at the potential for a terrorist weapon, they won't have all this complexity. They'll just have the chunk of metal and explosive. And those are what we call dirty bombs. They spray radioactive material everywhere. So that's one of the reasons we are very concerned, especially when the Soviet Union first broke up back in the early 90s. Like, what happened to all their weapons? Could any of it have gotten into the wrong hands, right? That's a very big concern. It's a concern even today about where that stuff is and who's controlling it.
Okay, interesting comment here from Joe. He says, "You are scaring everyone." Well, we're giving you information. It's a scary world. Would you rather not have the information? I myself would rather know the reality so I can adjust my life and my life choices to that. You do you, Joe. Let's go to the next question here. And that is any defense possible?
So the question is, defending what? And so the way we structured our defense, and again, just to let everybody know, I worked on the defense side. I've never worked on creating a weapon, launching a weapon, fielding weapons. I've never been on, if you wish, the war-making side. All the work I did was on the defensive side, on exactly this question. So we designed all of our equipment, all of our systems, all of our networks to be able to continue operating even if a nuclear attack happened. And that's really, your best offense is a good defense. If you know that the other side can come at you, but you can still be operating, that deflects the other side from attacking, right? Because they know we can attack, but these people will still be able to operate.
So that would deter a first strike.
Right, exactly. So our bunkers, our missile systems, all of those are basically designed where you have to have an absolute dead accurate strike right on top of it to damage it. And that means that if you miss by 50 feet, it still works. Now, what that means is if the other side is going to attack every bunker and every missile, they're going to have to send several at each to make sure they get one that hits it exactly. Because, guidance systems are good, but you've got to be within tens of feet. That's hard to do. But that means for every one of our rockets, they might have to launch 3 or 4 of theirs. Right? That becomes untenable, right? Because they're not going to have 3, 4, 5, 10, 100 times the weaponry in order to be sure that they're going to take out all of yours. We designed all our satellites that, if it takes a direct hit, okay, we're going to lose it, but the next satellite over is going to keep working. So you're going to have to launch a lot of rockets with a lot of bombs to take out everything we have. So the reason one of the big reasons, there are many reasons, but one of the big reasons the Soviet Union collapsed was they couldn't afford to do this. They were trying to build more and more stuff, and they just ran out of money. And that was a good thing. And we lived peaceably for 30 years because we succeeded at doing that.
Now, has there been testing on the offensive side? Is that what testing is for? Has there been more testing, I guess is my question. Did the treaties disallow any testing at all?
Correct. So since 1992, there has been no nuclear testing of any kind. There are still tests of different kinds of conventional explosives, but there has not been a nuclear source detonated since 1992, except by the Koreans. The North Koreans have launched several, as you may remember, a number of years ago. And that was scary because they're like, oh yeah, we've got them now and we're going to prove to you that we have them. So the North Koreans detonated a number, but we have not tested any since 1992, which is 30 years ago. September will be 30 years since we ceased doing that testing. So now it's all done by computers. You calculate it. And the fact that we have a lot of test data from many years ago means we understand the radiation and how it works. And we validate systems with computer models now instead of doing testing underground.
Related to testing, how about maintenance? How do they know that they'll actually work? And have the Russians are not rich. They don't have a lot of money. Is there a chance that their ordnance won't work?
There's always a chance of that. A lot of our systems, there is a maintenance process. So periodically, certain weapons are taken out of the inventory, taken apart, checked, look for any kinds of corrosion. You can still update electronics and replace materials, but you just don't, you're not making new stuff. And so they can be updated and tested and checked. Now, tested by actually setting one off? No, we haven't done that in 30 years. But testing in terms of, do all the other parts still work? Yeah, we can still check that. It's just not going to fire off nuclear material.
Now, what about other weapons of mass destruction besides nuclear, biological, chemical? They have those weapons too. And how does that fit in? Would that elicit the same response? Probably not. How much does that ratchet things up? How much does that change things if they should use these weapons?
Those, from my mind, have always been scarier because they're much easier to do. And especially from a terrorist standpoint. I mean, here at least we know there are sort of sovereign nations which are in the conflict. And there's somebody in control, you know who that is, and they have some rules, sort of. But if you look at a terrorist thing, one bottle of a bad bug dropped into the water system of a major city, and you have big problems. So chemical and biological weapons are a really serious issue. Chemical weapons have been used in war. They were used with Iran and Iraq in their wars before we got involved. And they're nasty, and they're very hard to defeat. And they're hard to defeat because, so for what it's worth, a nuclear weapon, a lot of things have to work perfectly for the bomb to go off, right? It's very hard to make the bomb go off. A chemical weapon is you've got a Coke can full of ugly stuff, and if you get a hole in the can, the ugly stuff comes out. So how do you destroy it without releasing the stuff? Right. It's actually very hard to do. And we, in our company, we looked at some of those problems. We said, okay, if a missile, this was during the Iraq conflict when they were sending Scud missiles with chemical and biological weapons. Mm-hmm. And we said, what could you do? And believe it or not, if you set off a nuclear weapon near their weapon, you denature part of it, you destroy part of it, but part of it still survives. It's remarkably hard to keep that stuff from happening. So that, to me, personally, that's scarier. I mean, nuclear weapons are a really bad thing, but everybody knows they're a bad thing. They're hard to hide. you can check on them. But chemical and biological weapons, that's scary stuff.
Folks, we're speaking with Doug Arion. He's a physicist, and he worked for a long time testing and working on the defense of our nation against nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction. How many weapons do they have? And does it matter how many weapons they have? There must be some number above which it doesn't matter. And how does that compare to how many we have?
Right. So by treaty, the number of reentry vehicles, number of fielded nuclear weapons is limited, and it's in the thousands. It's somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000. I don't remember the exact number, but it's somewhere like that. And that's plenty to wipe out huge, it would be a disaster if 3,000 nuclear weapons went off. And to your point, there's a point where enough is enough. I mean, if 3,000 will kill everything, why have 10,000? It's just not. It's crazy. So having more doesn't really matter.
Have you thought through, and I imagine you have, just what effects on society one like if one wiped out, I don't even want to say a city because it's too sad, a major European city, wouldn't that be catastrophic in terms of everything? Financial systems, everything would change, correct?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, even without a nuclear weapon going off, look what's happened to the world systems just because Russia has gone into Ukraine.
Right.
The financial markets are all turbulent. The equity and oil market, right? All of these different things are totally in turmoil at this point because you don't know what's going to happen. And uncertainty is bad. And returning back to a Cold War situation, if Russia started basically taking back the territories that broke away in 1991 and 1992, we're going back to the 80s. Nobody wants to go back to that, right? I mean, that was a terror period. And certainly if a nuclear weapon or a weapon of mass destruction was used on a major civilian city, civilization as we know it, civilization with a capital C, civilized behavior, is gone. It would be horrible, and we're hoping that everybody knows that, right? That would keep it from happening.
Do we know where their nukes are? To what degree do we know where they are? I know we know where some of them are, but what percent do we have a finger on?
I'm not in the intelligence community, but I would guess we know where they are. The things that you don't really know are things like submarines. Submarines are very hard to find, and that's why they're the most powerful nuclear deterrent you have. Submarines are almost impossible to find. So that would be the part where you're like, not quite sure where those are. But the ones on the ground, the missile silos are all known. Their Air Force bases are all known. And the same is true of them. They know where ours are. So that's pretty well understood, I think.
Is there any chance of, I hope it never would come to that, of disabling, ruining, destroying their devices, the ones we know where they are, before they get off the ground?
Well, that's the issue. And that applies in both directions, right? Could a first strike system of any kind work, right? I mean, a first strike system is you launch everything you have, you take out all of their stuff, and they can't retaliate, right? That's the ultimate game, right? And it's unlikely that you could be 100% sure of getting 100% of everything.
If you had launched enough weapons to do that, though, that would be the Earth would be over, correct?
Oh yeah.
So that doesn't seem like a viable option.
No.
And well, okay. So this is a big question, and I'm sure it's been thought about, and I'm sure there's a protocol. If Putin launched a nuclear weapon, would we or our allies retaliate or not. I mean, we're trained to think we would, but then you have to kind of think it through. What would it accomplish? What are your thoughts? What is your knowledge regarding that?
Well, again, that's a political question and not a science question. And I'm not an expert, but I think it would be very, very difficult for us to retaliate with nuclear weapons. I think we could be drawn into a conventional conflict if it got escalated to that point. Actually using strategic nuclear weapons, I don't know that anybody has the stomach to do that.
But that would open the door.
That's an aspect here we have to look at, that there are two whole classes of nuclear weapons. There are ones that are called tactical nuclear weapons, and there are ones called strategic. The strategic are the really big bombs, the ones that are launched on rockets that take out whole cities, that can be sent off in space and create all sorts of big effects. And then you have much smaller weapons. They're actually mortar-launched nuclear weapons, things that can be launched in the field that affect a much smaller area, but obviously are way more effective than launching a regular mortar shell. And so those are the ones that you're more at risk of seeing. And then you're still hopefully in an escalated conventional conflict and not in a true nuclear exchange conflict. But it's a good question. What would the response be if something ugly got used?
Obviously, they have to think that we would go nuts on them. If they thought we would not retaliate, then that's a dangerous thing.
That's a very dangerous thing. And right now, we've said we're not going to send troops to Ukraine. We're not going to put our airplanes in the air to defend their airspace, right? We're not going to have a no-fly zone, because those would escalate the conflict. It would put us directly fighting Russians. And this conflict continues, and the question is, can there be some form of settlement that will appease the Russians? But that means they're going to have greater influence, and they're going to be emboldened to go after the next thing that says, oh, maybe we can take over a chunk of this place and a chunk of that place.
Yeah. This time, though, unlike the previous two times, the cost to them seems massive. And I got to figure that Putin miscalculated, because I don't see how just simply having Ukraine as a buffer between NATO and Russia is worth the hell that he and his country are undergoing now. It doesn't seem like a good deal.
It doesn't look like that to us, but apparently it looks like a good deal to him and those who follow him, who are willing to pursue this. And how it plays out is going to be interesting to see how it plays out. And maybe if he does get Ukraine to say, okay, we promise to be neutral and not join NATO, the question is any of that enough to appease him? And I don't know.
So we're operating under a certain value system, and it does seem like he operates under a different value system, because it's no doubt that they purposely target civilians and even hospitals and things of that nature to inflict the most horrible human costs, and do that as a cudgel to hammer us with. We like to think we wouldn't do that. And if he would do that, what wouldn't he do? I guess. It's pretty hard to be inside his head. I know there are people who are paid to be inside his head, but my big worry is that he's thinking, you know what? If they push me into a corner, I'm taking everyone out with me. That's my fear.
I hope not. I don't think any of us could accept that as a possibility. What you truly hope is that if this goes south in a big way, that he ends up being deposed, that forces within Russia will change what happens. I think that's sort of the hope here, is that if this drags on and becomes truly ugly for a long time because they can't make good progress, and yes, this is very painful for Ukraine. If this went on for a year or two or three or five, but that over that time frame, there would be enough people in Russia, senior generals, who are going, this is not working. This guy is making a mess of this. We're using up all our stuff. I mean, think about how many tanks and planes and all this other stuff are being destroyed, how many Russian soldiers are dying, that eventually there would be a huge push within Russia to go, we need to stop this and we need to get rid of this guy.
Right. If for no other reason that he's failing militarily. I mean, the plan is not working. The column of tanks ran out of gas.
Exactly.
What is it? A multi-kilometer line of tanks ran out of gas.
Right. And you hope he continues to make mistakes like that. So a sort of a sideball comment here. When I was at Carthage, I also coached the hockey team for many, many years. And I always told my players, I said, I can tolerate being beaten, but I hate to lose. And by that I meant, if I play a team and they're better, they're just plain better, they're faster, they're stronger, they do whatever, and they beat us, okay, it was fair and square, they beat us. But if you do things and you play badly and the other team beats you, you don't back check, you don't cover the people in front of the net, and they keep scoring, that's losing. That makes you mad. And here, right now, it's not so much that Russia's being beaten, they're losing. They're screwing up on their own end, like not fueling their stuff, not providing supplies, not having the right things in the right places. And that's helpful to us. Just as you're saying, that kind of thing reflects back, right, on Putin and his leadership and saying, we're not good at this. We shouldn't be here. And you hope that has some effect.
And along the same lines, there's the will of the people. They are fed misinformation, but it's not like it used to be. People have VPNs. People get information. At some point, maybe it'll just get so miserable for them, they'll have nothing to lose, and chaos will break out in the streets that's unquenchable.
Well, that happened, just look at the fall of the Berlin Wall, which was basically that, right? You just got to a point where the people were fed up and they like, okay, that's it. We're done with this. And frankly, the breakup of the Soviet Union was like that. Their economy was trashed because of all the defense spending, which we forced upon them by the work of my colleagues and myself and many diplomats and all the work that got done to make it impossible for them to succeed. And finally, enough of the population said, all right, that's it, we're done. And that changes it.
Okay, in closing, do you have any words to make us feel better? That's a tense situation. You don't seem that stressed out up there in New Hampshire. So what are your thought patterns that are helping you?
I think the Ukraine situation is very bad, but I do believe that at least the Russians have the same fundamental, this is going to sound odd, but the same fundamental culture that we have. And that's different than what happened on 9/11, for example. When you work with a group of people who are perfectly happy dying to come up with a result, threatening to kill them doesn't solve anything.
No.
But here, Russians don't like to die. They're not intent on suicide missions, right? Putting themselves at risk. They're of the same culture we are. So I'm hoping that along the lines of things you've been saying during our chat today, that is going to end up providing an ending to this, because they're going to go, no, we don't want to die in this process. So I'm hoping that the fact that they and we are actually more alike than most people will admit, will come to the point of going, okay, this is not a good thing.
Doug Arion, physicist and astronomer, I have a kind of a new rule that I don't hang around with anyone I don't learn from. So I'm going to be hanging around with you a lot, because I always learn a great deal when I hang around with you. And we can also go on a hike again, if you promise not to go up the hill so fast.
Okay, I'll try that. There's some fun places.
We can go for a walk on a flat dirt road. I can walk fast on a flat dirt road. All right, thank you so very much. Hopefully we'll speak to you next month. There's a lot of things coming up there. We did talk about the eclipses, but there's always something science-based that Doug can teach us about. Thank you so much, Doug Arion.
Thanks a lot, Bradley. Fun to talk to you again.
And everybody, feel free. I encourage you to share this. Bye now. We'll be clear.